I find it very interesting looking at the results of the vote last night for the ceasefire in Gaza. 294 voted against it, and 222 abstained. So the people who voted for the ceasefire were a very small group in Parliament, and many of those have now lost their jobs on the Labour front bench. Not significant people, nobody whose name I know. Uh, almost the entirety of the Liberal Party voted for the ceasefire. I think three people abstained. Anyway, it's the abstentions, it's the people who didn't vote, who I think are the most interesting candidates. The 141 Labour people, the 57 Conservatives, and so on. And you have to ask why they didn't vote. So in the end, it comes to one word. You either want it or you don't want it. There may be different reasons why you don't want it. So I don't think anybody is urging Israel just simply to fight and kill everything in its path. I don't think anybody wants that. But the actual term ceasefire is a technical term, and that is a problematic issue. In the same way as it's a problematic issue to demand that President Zelensky accepts a Russian ceasefire on Russian terms, in other words, the Minsk Accord, the Minsk treaties, first or second, imposed on Ukraine by Russia and accepted by Russia's poodles, who were effectively in power in Ukraine at the time and monitored by some European states who thought that it was buying time while Ukraine adjusted to the occupation of Crimea. And Putin is doing with Ukraine exactly what he did with Georgia a while ago, by forcing Ukrainians to accept Russian passports so that they are identified as Russian. So if you are ill and you want medicine, you have to have a Russian passport now, if you are part of those occupied areas. But I think people should be writing to their MP to express disappointment in those who didn't vote. An abstention from a vote on the ceasefire is probably worse than voting for or against a ceasefire. And it's about the triggers of Western democracy, the power of the Western voice. So, for example, the impact that Western leaders had on the Kosovo crisis in 1999, the British government's active diplomacy in solving that crisis goes a long way to establishing that we in Britain still have a voice. But where is our voice now? I hope that Lord Cameron is on his way to see Netanyahu. I hope. And I hope that he's going to be able to put forward the view, not that slap on the back, every country has a right to self-defense, but you need to build on the principles that have been established, the humanitarian principles, humanitarian roads, pauses. And now having gone into the Al-Shifa hospital, having seen what is there, it's now your duty to take people out and to offer them support elsewhere. It's not just enough to say, okay, cancer patients can be sent off to Turkey. That's good. And President Erdogan can go and see them, as he did this afternoon in the new hospital in Turkey. But it's something that we should be expecting an occupying power to say, yes, I have a humanitarian responsibility. And in the same way, asking for a ceasefire in Gaza on Hamas's terms, without releasing the hostages, without surrendering their equipment, without destroying their tunnels, is acknowledging that a terrorist atrocity is acceptable. It's not. And Israel could say quite reasonably that there was a ceasefire until October the 7th. That ceasefire was broken by Hamas. Does Hamas dictate when there's a ceasefire and when there's not a ceasefire? No. In the same way, President Zelensky is constrained now by the need for weapons and support from the West in order to make very, very small gains. His troops have now got onto the south side of the Dnipro River. It's a major achievement, and yet we wouldn't know it because our televisions are dominated by pictures from Gaza. And yet Zelensky desperately needs our help. Otherwise, he's going to be put in a position where he accepts a stalemate, during which time the enormous Russian resources can drive up another attack and overwhelm Ukraine, simply for want of support, because he's no longer the man of the moment. What is happening in Gaza and Israel is a shadow of what has been happening in Ukraine. And it's a great shock, really, when you think about it, that simply because these images are on our television screens, are covering our Twitter feed, that we are responding with horror to those, and we didn't respond with horror to the same sort of scenes as they are unfolding in Ukraine. What we see in Israel today, what we see in Palestine today, what we see in Gaza today, we saw in Ukraine yesterday. The difference is we have an extremely complex moral situation where we're saying, yes, the Zelensky and Ukraine has a right to resist occupation, and Israel has a right to pursue its strategic defense. Well, I think Israel should not be in a state of war in Hamas against Hamas in Gaza. Israel has every right to defend itself. Israel has every right to resent and object to the terrorist operation in the Negev, but it should have pursued a more international attack on the Hamas terrorists, and it should also have done everything to get the civilians out of the way. That means it should have taken a little bit more time to set things up. Now, the destruction of the land would almost certainly have occurred one way or the other, but not if there'd been a bigger pause and greater international consensus rallied. Not such an appalling loss of life. I think a ceasefire is out of the question while Hamas is still underground. I think peace is absolutely on the agenda. And at any moment, if Hamas were to surrender the hostages, a ceasefire would be inevitable and peace would be something that could be automatically negotiated. And in the same way, the moment Putin's armies show a sign of retreating, I think again, peace is inevitable and can be negotiated. A ceasefire is inevitable and can be negotiated, even if not all the territory is ceded. back to Ukraine. But at the moment, we have to work hard on our diplomatic initiatives, and I'm not sure that is what Britain is doing. It seems to me as if we have a series of slogans rather than a process of listening and helping. We have a historical investment in the Israel-Palestinian conflict dating back to the partition of Palestine in the 1940s and further back to the beginning of the British Mandate in the 1920s. The ongoing conflict is a result of the displacement of countless Palestinians and something that observers would call ethnic cleansing. And we should be at the forefront of the negotiations for peace and justice. And it's those two things as well. And justice not only for the displaced Palestinians, but also for the Israelis who've made their home there. So many Israelis have been displaced by the Hamas terrorists. We cannot reward terrorism. So, to be absent from a vote sends a message of indifference, especially to the area itself. It sends a message that everything can just go on as it is, and that's not the message we should be giving. It's a qualified approval for continuing the war. It's qualified, and that's not the message that we get from this vote. This vote is probably the worst message that we could be sending. The idea that you're going to have a vote which will be so roundly defeated and will also throw up such indifference and a lack of proactive involvement in the discussion, this is wrong. The leadership of every single MP in this country is essential in helping to force our diplomatic machine to take action, to help resolve the problem, to help pave the way for the inevitable peace. And we need to be a part of that peace. We need to be helping to reconstruct not only Palestine and the villages destroyed in the south of Israel, but also the towns, the villages, the cities around Ukraine. We need to be there to help. And our manifestation of indifference in the vote on Gaza, indifference. I think there's a line in the Bible which says, "You be hot or cold, but lukewarm, I spit you out of my mouth." I can think of quite a number of individuals that deserve to be spat out of the mouth. 222 of them, in fact. Nothing less than to be spat out of the mouth.